so much, Nancy King, for joining the library for an event. The structure of this event will first be an introduction, then a stories and a talk from author Nancy King, and then lastly we'll have time to take questions, discuss, and take comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to write it in the chat box, and I will address it there for you. And yeah, feel free to write any questions in that chat box. We very much encourage you all to ask questions, make comments. So please type in any questions you have in the chat box or that Q&A. And yeah, I can address it. I can ask for you, or you can unmute yourself at the appropriate time and ask yourself. All right. We have about 22 folks with us. Thank you all. Nancy, I am going to, oh wait, no, I think I'm going to mute a couple of you because I'm hearing some feedback. All right. Nancy King is a widely published author and a professor. Please help me pronounce this word, Nancy.
Right.
Emerita? Professor Emerita?
Oh, emerita. It's emeritus. And when I'm teasing people, I say emeritushi.
Emeritushi at the University of Delaware. Thank you, Nancy. Where she has taught theater, drama, playwriting, creative writing, and multidisciplinary studies with an emphasis on world literature. She has published 7 previous works of nonfiction and 5 novels. Her new memoir, Breaking the Silence, if you see behind me, this is actually the cover of Nancy King's book, Breaking the Silence, explores the power of stories in healing from trauma and abuse. Her career has emphasized the use of her own experience in being silenced to encourage students to find their voices and to express their thoughts, feelings, and experiences with authenticity as a way to add meaning to their lives. Please welcome Nancy King.
Thank you, Jessica and Maria, for making this possible. I would just like to say that stories matter. All stories matter. The stories we've been told by our parents and family, the stories we tell ourselves, the story we tell other people. And there are also world stories. And world stories have been my companions for as long as I could read, which was since I was 3. I don't recommend the way I learned to read, but my cousin who was 6 had polio, and I was one of the designated entertainers. And she quickly grew tired of my inability to tell jokes. And I went into the kitchen, and my aunt and my mother were having coffee, and they said, go back. Your cousin doesn't like to be alone. And they said, you're a storyteller, tell her stories. I started telling her stories, and she quickly interrupted me, and she said, read to me. And I said, well, I don't know how to read. Now, I have no memory of her teaching me, but I can tell you this. She quickly gave me a book, and somehow or other, I learned to read it. The problem was I didn't know some of the words. And so when I started to hesitate about the words, she would go, and I thought, I didn't know what die was, but they talked about her dying. And I thought that must be it. And it sounded terrible. And so when I came to a word I didn't know, I made it up. And then it was so much fun making things up. I made up stories between the stories. And since she couldn't see the book, I was really home free and she didn't die. So I learned at a very early age the power of stories. And Claudia Breda is one of the visitors here, and she and I have been collaborators in telling stories. And I'd like to start with a favorite short story of mine, because some of the world stories are what I call talisman stories. They live in my heart and my soul and my body and my mind. And when I get into trouble, I pull out a story. Now, I'm not in trouble, but I'm nervous, so I'm going to pull out this story. And it goes like this. Little Parrot loved the jungle, and she loved it more than anything else in the world. And every morning she'd fly over the jungle, see that all was well, fly home and eat breakfast. But one morning she flew over the jungle and there was a thick plume of smoke. The jungle was on fire. And little Parrot didn't know what to do. And the only thing she could think of was she would fly to the river, take up as much water as she could, go over the fire, whoosh it out. And she kept doing it until she heard a really loud voice, very harsh, saying, Parrot, you're so little, you'll never put that fire out. Why don't you just go home? And little Parrot looked up and said, I don't need advice, I need help. And she kept flying to the river and flying back. And pretty soon there was a huge whoosh of water. And then Parrot flew back and forth. And with this whoosh water, the fire was soon out. And so with the last bit of strength little Parrot had, she flew up and saw that it was Eagle. And she said, oh, Eagle, thank you so much. You have saved the jungle. And Eagle said, no, it is I who must thank you. So coping mechanisms have a shelf life. And I have a lot of coping mechanisms that I've had to discard. And so one of the things that was very difficult for me was asking for help. And so Parrot reminds me that from the beginning of time, one wise person who ever started the story said, I don't need advice, I need help. So I've gotten help. And I had a lot of help writing this memoir in different ways. It began actually when I was 80, almost 5 years ago. And I decided I wanted to celebrate it in a really special way. And so I signed up for a vision quest, 4 days and 4 nights in the wilderness without any devices, books, games.
Sorry, Nancy, you got muted. So sorry.
So it was just me by myself for 4 days and 4 nights in the forest. And when you have no distractions and you've done some work, I had been seeing a body therapist and a talking therapist. And a lot of the work I had done was trying to connect my mind, my body, and my soul. And my mind and body don't really talk together very much. In fact, they have very conflicting conversations. The mind says one thing, the body says another, and it's not so wonderful. But in the forest, my body and my mind began to talk to each other. And what they decided was it was time for me to pull the veil back on what had happened to me as a child and as an adult, and to connect myself with my own experience, which I hadn't been able to do. And I did it. I'm not supposed to talk about the exact things that happened in the forest. It's considered medicine, but I can tell you, I whacked a lot of sticks. And in the whacking, I uncovered a lot of feelings that I hadn't allowed myself to feel. And the more I felt, the more I remembered. And the more I remembered, the more my head just started to fill up. And so I had a journal and I started jotting the things down. Unfortunately, I have a terrible handwriting, so I couldn't read what I wrote very easily. But at the end of the 4 nights and 4 days in the wilderness, we came together as a group to process. And I was the last one. I was also the oldest. And I think my story was the harshest. And I told about a couple of events that I had felt great shame about what I had done. And the people in the group listened quietly, supportively, no judgment, no, how shall I say it? No barriers. They were really open to the story. And when I finished, there was a kind of silence. And I thought, oh gosh, I've said too much, or I should have said this, or shouldn't have said that. And as a group, they just came up on us and we had this group hug. And I can only bear a little bit of emotion. And in the middle of this group hug, I yelled, I'm hungry. Could we just eat? And everybody laughed. And we went downstairs and had snacks. But that power of telling my story without censoring, without shame, without guilt, without judgment was an absolutely heart-opening experience. And it, it helped me to understand why, through the course of my life, I had what I called images. I didn't really know what they were, but they never changed. And so when I started writing this memoir, I wrote it associatively, which meant one memory triggered another memory. And at first, I tried to stay back and I wrote it as third person um, and past tense. And it got kind of complicated, you know, the woman, who, she, her, that didn't work. And so then I said, okay, I'll do first person past tense. And it was like the theater curtain stayed down, wouldn't go up. And I thought, okay, I will write it first person present tense. And then it was amazing. It just flowed. One memory flowed into another memory. There was no rhyme nor reason. They just flowed. And when I had about 300 pages, I sent them to my editor. And she said, Nancy, the writing is fine, but I can't make head or tail of how old you are. It has got to be chronological. Oy. Everything was on a computer. I am not very computer savvy. So I had to print out the 300 pages and reorder them in paper and then cut and paste so that I had a chronological story event. And a memoir is usually a part of one's life. And the reason I call this a memoir is because the arc of the memoir is about healing, finding my voice, being able to say, yes, this happened to me. It doesn't define me. It's like in 1985, when I was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia, I had to make a decision. I am not my illness. I will do what I have to do, but that's not who I am. And so the memoir also includes some stories that show the development of how I found my voice. I'd like to start with something that happened when I was 5 years old, well, 5.5. My mother loved Paul Robeson. I guess most of you know he was a very handsome, well-built Black man who had been a captain of a football team in Princeton, and he graduated from law school, and nobody would hire a Black man as a lawyer. And so he became a performer and singer, and his voice was just wonderful. And we had all his records. And when my mother played the records, she would sit on the couch and I would sit opposite her because she didn't like me to cuddle her. And for as long as Paul Robeson was singing, there was peace in the house. She never, ever hit me while Paul Robeson was singing. I could have lived in Paul Robeson's voice. But anyway, one day she said to me that Paul Robeson was going to be giving a house concert. And I was really excited. I was going to get to see Paul Robeson until she said, and you'll be upstairs taking care of your baby sister who was a couple of months old. Well, there was no arguing with that. So we went upstairs and there was this big bedroom and with a big bed and the perfume, ugh, it was terrible. But anyway, I was up there feeling very sorry for myself. And then I heard a baby crying and it wasn't my sister. And I listened and there were steps. Somebody was walking up the steps. And then I heard this voice singing, "Oh, my baby, my curly-headed baby." And there was only one voice in the whole world that could be. Paul Robeson was in the next room singing to a baby. Well, I didn't know the word jealous, but I was beyond jealous. I wanted him to be singing to me. And so I got up out of bed and I made sure my sister wasn't going to fall out of bed. And I walked to the door and there was Paul Robeson sitting in a chair with this little baby, and he was singing to this baby. And I wanted to be that baby so badly. I just could hardly contain myself. Well, I must have been projecting so much emotion. He turned and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, little one, would you like to come and join us?" I couldn't even speak. And he made room. And so there I was sitting on his lap with his arm around me and the other arm around the baby. And I'm leaning against his big chest and he is singing. And I can feel the vibrations. I'm in seventh heaven until I heard more steps. And pretty soon my mother was there and she started screaming, "Nancy, you're disturbing Mr. Robeson. Get back to bed. Your sister will fall out of bed." And I thought she was just going to come up and hit me right with Mr. Robeson's. And instead he said, "Ma'am, she's not bothering anybody. I'll put her back to bed when the song's finished. Now, why don't you just go down the stairs, ma'am? I'll be down in a few minutes." And much to my utter astonishment, my mother, who never did anything anybody wanted her to do if she didn't want to do it, she looked at Mr. Robeson and she turned around and she went back down those stairs. Oh, and he sat, the two of us, the little baby here and me here, and he sang that song. And then he said, "Well, I guess it's time for me to go downstairs." And I got off his lap, but I didn't leave the room. And I waited until he put the baby back in the crib. And then he walked me to the door and he kissed the top of my head. And he watched me get into bed with my sister. And he said, "Good night." And I said, "Good night, Mr. Robeson." And he went back down the stairs. And I didn't really realize, and I couldn't have expressed it as this way, but I was convinced that this wonderful man could walk on water. And so whenever I heard any prejudice or any bad comments, I would think about my time with Mr. Ropes and I said, "Oh, no, you're wrong. They're wonderful people." I mean, of course, everybody has good and bad people, but it made such an impression because it was the first time in my life I could remember feeling safe. And it was the first time anybody ever made my mother go down the stairs. So that's one of the memories that came back to me that I hadn't realized, and it it gave me a sense of what it felt like to feel safe. And then a few years later, when I was 7, my parents sent me to a sleepaway camp, which I hated. I was in a bunk with 9-year-olds, and I was only 7, and they teased me and they called me baby and all sorts of things. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand the food. I couldn't stand the counselors. I wanted to wear a skirt. They wouldn't let me wear a skirt. I had to wear shorts. Everybody was telling me what to do. And so what did I do? I ran away into the forest. And there was a boy. And he was just walking in the woods. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I don't like camp, so I've decided to live in the woods." And he said, "Well, if you're going to live in the woods, I better tell you some things." He was only 9, but he knew a lot about the woods. And he showed me what plants were edible. And it was just wonderful. And he held my hand and we walked into the woods and birds were singing and the sun was shining. And I felt better than I had for a long time. And then he said, "Well, we better go back." And we agreed we would meet. So when it was convenient and when we had agreed, I would run into the woods and meet Peter and we would walk in the woods. Well, this didn't go well with the counselors. And I think it was the 3rd time they caught us. And he was not allowed to walk in the woods with me anymore. And I was not allowed to walk in the woods. But I hated being told what to do. So when we were switching to going to different things and like people were going to arts and crafts or swimming, I would run back in the woods. And of course, they knew where I was. And they would pull me out, but I kept running. And then one day I fell asleep and the nature counselor found me. And she said to me, "You really like being in the woods, don't you?" Duh. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, why don't you be my assistant and we can spend a lot of time in the woods studying nature." And so that's how I survived camp. And it's also the first time that I ran into the woods and realized that for me, nature was a salvation. was a place of safety, and I never felt in danger, even though, of course, it could happen. And so another time that I found in nature, I was in a program shortly after I was diagnosed. I needed something that would get me more than just week to week. And so I signed up for something called the Human Capacities Program. And I'm not too good with groups. And at one point, I had had enough. And I decided after supper, I was going to go and take a walk in the woods, which I did. The only problem was I had the feeling that I wasn't alone. And I wasn't alone because walking alongside of me on the other side of the bushes was a mountain lion. And I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know what to do. I figured if it was going to eat me, it was going to eat me. But I know how to walk in the woods really silently. And so I walked as quietly as I could. And I actually sang, I'm just walking on my way. I have no reason to stay, which was nonsensical, but it made me feel better. And the whole length of the lake, that mountain lion accompanied me, or I accompanied it. I'm not sure which. And then it got to a point where I had to turn left because I was going to walk around the lake. And I said, well, goodbye, Mr. Lion. And I turned left and it started up the hill and it went, well, I continued my walk. And when I got back to the group, they said, you look like something really, what happened? And I said, well, I just took a walk with a mountain lion. And of course, they wanted to know what, where, when, why. And suddenly I realized that was a precious experience and I didn't really want to share it. But the next morning, hunters came up to me and said, we've been looking for that lion. Where was it? I said, oh, I don't remember. I don't remember. I wasn't going to tell anybody where that lion was. And so the next morning, I decided to do a yoga meditation, which I hated. It meant sitting in the wet grass for an hour, and usually it just took forever. But this time, the teacher took me aside and said, you know, I think that mountain lion had a message for you. I think you should sit and think about talking with the lion. Right. But the weirdest thing happened. I went down to a place, I can't even tell you where it was. And suddenly the lion was there and it was talking to me and it was saying, do you know why I'm here? And I said, no. And he said, well, can you remember seeing me? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I have a message for you. He said, you always doubt yourself. You let other people tell you what your reality is. And I'm here to tell you, you need to face it. You need to take care of your own reality. And I was talking to the lion, I don't know for how long. And finally, I heard something in the distance yelling, but I can't tell you what it was. And then I felt something on my shoulder and I jumped. And it was the meditation leader. And she had been calling me for a while. She was really worried about me. She said she'd never had anybody go down so deep. And I'd never done it before. But the sense of talking with this lion was so powerful. She said, you know, don't worry about breakfast. Just go to the lake and I'll bring you something to eat. You need to think about what just happened. And the truth is, I'm a very slow learner. It took a long time for me to really incorporate what the lion said into my psyche. And I don't know if that psyche is the right word, but I started writing stories, popping out stories. They would just literally pop out either on the typewriter or later in the computer. And I would type them out in one sitting. And almost all of them had abuse, incest, violence, murderous thing. And I was getting so irritated myself, like I was just a one-note pony and I couldn't write anything but incest and murderous violence. I didn't realize that it was my psyche or whatever that process is trying to reconnect me with myself. But it didn't really work because my mind stayed here and my body stayed here. And even when I had an experience as a professor, we had read a book called Floating in My Mother's Palm by Ursula Heggie. And I asked my students to pick, it's a collection of connected stories, to pick a story, pick an idea, and write about it. And the process was they would give it to the writing fellow. The writing fellow would make suggestions, and then they would give me the paper. So I got at least the second draft. And a student came to my office and he said, I don't want to give my paper to the writing fellow. Could I give it to you? And I said, sure. He was a big guy and quite a popular student in the class. And I thought he'd just give me the paper and leave, and he didn't. I said, well, do you want me to read it now? He said, yes. And so while he watched me, I read this paper, and it was referring to a chapter in the book where a young man is assaulted by an older man, and the girl in the story can hear the young man screams, but of course she doesn't know what's going on or why it's happening. And so I read this paper, and it was about one of his mother's friends who had been his friend, he thought, assaulting him sexually when he was 13, and feeling that it was his fault. And he was just in despair because it was like he couldn't push it down and he couldn't get it up. And he thought maybe if he wrote about it, that would help. So I read his paper, and this is why my body and mind don't talk to each other. I felt a really strong connection to him, but I wasn't exactly sure why. But I knew one thing, and I said to him, you were 13 years old, you were a child, you are not responsible. Nobody is responsible for being abused. And he began to argue with me. And I said, look, this is really serious. You need to go to the counseling center and talk to them about it. And he said, no, I don't want to. You know everything I know. And just talking to you makes a difference. And I said, but one session talking with me isn't, he said, I don't think you should tell me what's enough for me. Point taken. And I said, well, I just want you to know you are not responsible. You were 13. He said, but I was a big guy, almost as big. I mean, he was like 6'5". He was really big. He said, I was almost as big then as I am now. I said, you could have been 18 feet tall. You were 13 years old. You are not responsible. And I said, can I write something on your paper? And he said, sure. And I wrote, you are not responsible on his paper. And he looked at it and he started to laugh. He couldn't stop laughing. I thought, well, that's a good sign. Anyway, he said, I'll write a second draft, but I don't want to give it to the writing fellow. I said, I understand. Take your time and finish it whenever you're ready to finish it. And that was all we ever said about it. But in the weeks that followed, it was like he came back to life. He had good color, he started joking, and no reference was ever made to what he wrote. And so my own experiences, I couldn't deal with my experience, but they made me sensitive to the experiences of my students. And if you want to know how I became the teacher I am, I think the germ of it certainly happened when I was in 4th grade. I guess I was 9. And the teacher, Mrs. Magassi, the only teacher whose name I remember, said we should pick a book from the library, any book that we chose, and write a book report. Well, I had on my library card adult privilege, which meant I could read any book in the library. What made me pick out this book? I have no idea. But of all the books in the library, I picked out a book called The Springfield Experience. The Springfield Experiment. And it was about how children were going to be part of the curriculum and how they were going to be part of participating in what they would learn. And I thought this was amazing. I was so excited. I even made a lesson plan. And when it came time for us to do our book reports, I raised my hand. I wanted to be first, and she picked me. And I don't know that I got 2 sentences out. And the teacher said, let me see that book. And so I gave it to her. And she said, this is not a book for children. You should be finding a book for children. You'll have to sit down and get another book. And of course, all my classmates were tee-heeing and everybody was having a great time at my expense. And I was mortified. I was just absolutely filled with shame. And at the same time, I was furious. She didn't say I had to find a book that was for fourth graders. She didn't say what kind of a book we had to find. She just said, find a book that you like. I found a book that I liked, and I was talking about it, and it wasn't good enough. And when the class was over, she said, here, and she showed me 4 books, and she said, pick one of these. These are suitable. So I picked the first book, and I made a book report with about as much enthusiasm as a dead noodle. And she said, that was really great. You get an A. And I didn't really care. And of course, I got teased about it for the rest of the year. But I thought, if she wanted us to read a book suitable for fourth graders, she should have said, find a book suitable for fourth graders. She just said, find a book you like. And I had found a book that I liked. And so when I became a teacher, I realized that it's really easy to make students feel bad. No trouble at all. But to find a way to engage them in their work and to allow them to tell their stories without judgment, without censoring, without shame, that took some work. And I finally found ways, even in the theater department, where it's easy to critique and then your work is left in pieces. And so I found a way where people would just ask questions, and my students would write the questions down, and then they would maybe work on them or not, but the work grew and blossomed and developed, and nobody felt shame and nobody felt judged. And I actually became a teacher because I thought, I want to create a time and space where the children in my class could feel safe. And I hope that that's what I did. So for a long time, before I really knew the extent of the abuse and the trauma, I had an inkling about it, and I used it to help my students. And when I wrote the memoir, I started at the beginning, and I wrote about things that I'd never, ever, ever said out loud. And to this day, I've not said them out loud. And I think that's because when I was 4 and living with my aunt and uncle for almost a year, my uncle would sometimes say, if you tell anybody, I'll kill you. Other times he would say, if you tell somebody, we'll just leave, you'll have to leave. But I already been thrown away from my family or kicked out from my family, depending on my mood. And I was only 4, where would I go? And so, but nobody ever told me not to write. And so I've written a lot, and I've been very lucky with having it published. And a lot of my novels, some of my readers have reminded me that I put in actual stories of my life, but it was always in fiction. And when you write nonfiction, and when you write it as first person, present tense, and when I write, it's like I'm writing from a theater in my head, and I see it, I smell it, I taste it, I feel it. And so it was very raw. And what was interesting was the memoir is written in a series of stories, and each story has an arc. And I always tell people, if the stories are too harsh in the beginning, just move on. It gets better and better. And I'd like to, when my students were writing, they had to be in an okay position when they left. They would go to chemistry, math, or psychology. They couldn't be puddles. And so I developed this rubric. If they wrote and they didn't know how to stop, I could say, well, I taught a course called Journeys into Myth. And I say, well, look, if you're on a journey, the first place is a kind of resting place. It's maybe 11 o'clock and you're tired. There's a lovely stream and you sit down, you have something to eat, you take a rest. That's a good place to stop. Okay, if you're moving on the journey and it's getting towards night and you sleep in a sleeping bag or in a hotel room and you stop for the night, that's a stopping place. And if you're at the end of this journey, that's an ending place. But I couldn't end my memoir because I'm still alive, I think. And so how was I going to end the memoir in a way that felt authentic and honest? I mean, my life is a whole lot better than it was even 5 years ago. But I still sometimes have flashbacks, and I still have some dark times, although I feel really blessed in many ways. And so, how to end the memoir in an honest way and in a way that seemed to reassure people about where I am in the moment. And so I will tell you the ending story. I'm not going to read it because written words are meant to be read. And I'm a storyteller, so I'll tell you the story. And if you buy the book, you can read it there. But 2 years ago, I went to Peru to hike. And I was in a village with the other hikers, and they had all gone off, and I was by myself. And I was walking along the street, and all of a sudden I saw this little girl, about two, running out, and she came toward me. And so I bent down, and she just, like a port in a storm, she just pushed right into my body, hugging me, just hugging me. And I didn't really know what to do. I asked her in Spanish what her name was and so forth. She didn't say a word. She just kept hugging me. And my thighs started to burn, but she had no intention of leaving. So I just squatted there, and she kept hugging me. And then I could see out of the doorway came a woman smiling. And she walked over to where the little girl was hugging me, and she just watched. And then I asked the woman in Spanish if this was her daughter. Yes. And how old she was, too. And what was her name, Numha. And the woman just kept watching this little girl hugging me, didn't make a move to stop. And finally, the woman said, Numa, in Spanish, we have to go. But the little girl didn't move. And so the mother bent down and put her hand on the child's wrist and said, honey, darling, sweetie, whatever, we have to go. And the child gave me this most enormous hug, and then got up with her mother and walked away. And I got up, and for a moment I thought, did that just happen? But it turns out that one of the guides was behind me, and he said, I think you have a little magic in you. And I said, no, I think that little girl had magic. But that little girl's hug has stayed with me since. So that's kind of an arc of my memoir. And I'd like to open it up for questions or comments, whatever you'd like to say. And I guess, Jessica, you'll take care of that.
Yeah. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and go right ahead. If you'd like me to ask it for you, you can write it in the chat box there. We did get several questions emailed, but I know some of you are here. David, would you like me to read your question? Okay. Dr. King, your memoir, which details your journey through hellish cruelty to triumphant recovery. What do you think of the idea that forgiveness is the key to healing? I don't mean that forgiving should require forgetting, but do you think it is a helpful step for the victim of such cruelty?
Well, I have my own ideas about forgiveness. I like the idea in Judaism where if somebody has done you wrong, they come to you, especially during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where there are 10 days where you're supposed to clean your slate, but at any time, and they acknowledge what they did, and then more importantly, they say what they can do to make things better. Nobody in my family ever apologized or acknowledged what they did, with the exception of one of my mother's next youngest sister, who was 97 at the time, who told me she was very upset when I went to visit her. And I asked her why she was upset. And she said she had hurt somebody really badly. And I knew some of her friends. So I said, who? And she said, you. And she started crying. Please forgive me. I was terrible to you. And they all were terrible to you. And everybody knew about the troubles you were having and nobody did anything. And I'm so sorry. And I'm so sorry. Well, she's 97 years old. I said, of course, I forgive you, Fran. And, but I thought about forgiveness, and I have a different view. If somebody acknowledges what they did and wants to make things better, I don't have any trouble forgiving. I think that's just part of life. But if people don't acknowledge what they do and have no interest in admitting what they did, in fact, in my family, they blamed me. I just say, okay, what they did is what they did, and it's on them. And I'm going to focus on what's inside me and what needs to be healed. And I felt this most strongly when I was with a friend, and I told him, I said, you know, my father sexually abused me. And the first question he asked was, well, do you forgive him? And I thought, forgive him? What about me? And so I have a different view. I think that it's important to put on them what's theirs, and that's the end of it as far as I'm concerned. And then I focus on my healing. And so that's the way I deal with forgiveness.
Thank you.
Okay.
By the way, I should say the Greek, I'm told this anyway, the Greek translation for forgiveness is unwinding. And I've been unwinding for the last 5 years. So maybe I am forgiving. Huh?
This one came from an anonymous email, but if you're here and this is your question, feel free to speak up. When you write about telling stories, I wonder what kind they are. Are they escapist stories about walking in the woods and seeing the filtered sunlight, or are they total distractions about searching for hidden treasure?
Well, when I was a child, I would find a way to hide, and I would tell myself stories. And there, of course, I was always the heroine. I was saving children from burning buildings or from tsunami waves or monsters or oaks. But when I started writing stories, they started out as popping out stories. Now, I have, as you can imagine, I like world tales, and what I like about them is the sparseness of it. It's the old woman, the fat man, the pretty woman. In fact, I'd like to read what Joan Didion said about the description. She said, shape and content, make a place available to the eyes, and in certain ways, it is no longer available to the imagination, which gets me off the hook for descriptions. I don't have to describe because I let people's imaginations. So a lot of the early stories took the form of folk tales or fairy tales, but I discovered that in these so-called fictional tales, kernels of truth. And when I had my students write, sometimes they would write fiction and sometimes it would be nonfiction, sometimes it would, but it didn't really matter the genre because it always contained the truth that they needed to speak. And that's the way I feel stories work. If you don't muck around with them, you just let them come out, they're what you need to be telling.
Gil, are you,
Something?
yeah, go ahead, please.
Jill with a G.
From England.
Yeah, it's pretty late here. It's like 1:45 in the morning. Injecting an English accent. I wanted to say I was privileged to write the foreword, the preface for the book with Nancy. And I wanted to say that I really, if you haven't read it, I really encourage everybody to get it. I just wanted to say, I think Nancy is extraordinarily brave and courageous to write what she's written, to actually write it, and also to write it in such a creative way with all these intersecting stories. And I know from my own work that by talking it out, speaking it out, it's really important for perhaps enabling others to speak out and to learn about their own lives and past. So, oh, by the way, I did want to say that I'm sure you all know, but I just wanted to say that, of course, Nancy has an extraordinary career as a totally pioneering professor and teacher and storyteller, so all over the world. But my question would be then, how do you feel that your book can open this out for others and in terms of healing?
Well, actually, when I started writing it, I wasn't sure the world needed another memoir. And I sent about 30 or 40 pages to a student living in England, former student. And I said, this is what's coming out. What do you think? And she wrote back and said, I'm having a really hard time right now. And what you're writing is helping me. So please continue. And in my experience, stories beget stories. And I'm hoping that the format of writing the memoir as a series of stories will tweak people's memories, and they will think about their own lives, their own stories. And the fact is, the stories that my family told about me when I was a child turned out to be stories told by them for their benefit. They weren't actually true. And I mean, when I was 4, I had quite a lot of memories, and not all of them were terrible. You know, we went sledding, we went roller skating, and yet when I would talk about it, my mother would say, oh, never happened. You can't possibly remember. It's all your imagination. And so that's a kind of crazy making experience because, well, if it didn't happen, how come it's in my you know, you can see I haven't even got the words to express the confusion that I felt. And so I think it's really important for people to look at the stories that they tell themselves, the stories they tell friends. And, you know, when you tell a story, it's like, for example, if you want to talk about a tree, you can't talk about tree as tree. You have to talk about the branches or the leaves or the roots. So you select what matters to you in the telling. And the same thing is true when you tell stories about your life. You select what matters, what's on your mind, what's bothering you, especially if you're telling a friend who's not judgmental or censorious. And that's really important. I think one of the reasons that I stopped telling about my life, or I mean, there were times when I would talk about things and I couldn't shut up, but at the same time, it wasn't satisfying. And I didn't realize why it wasn't satisfying. And it was because I was trying to reconnect feelings with actions, with stories. And I would tell a story, but it had no feeling component. And once you have the story and the feeling component, in a sense, you've healed a part of yourself. So I think that telling stories, whatever kind of story you can tell, really matters. And I would like to thank Jill for what she wrote. Jill does a lot of work around the world, stopping the violence against women. And I have to say her support mattered because she has worked with a lot of victims of violence or survivors of violence. And if she had said, Nancy, you know, this book is kind of shallow and it doesn't really resonate. If she had in any way, shape or form said that or conveyed it, I would have stopped because I value her opinion so much, but she was very encouraging. And I was really grateful when she agreed to write the foreword. And even that process was healing because here was a person who was reading what I had never been able to say and understanding the power of disconnection and the importance of reconnection. And I would like to say at almost 85 that it's never too late to reconnect.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. We have a few more questions here. Elaine Coleman, I think she's also an author. Could you say more about coping methods having a shelf life?
Mhm.
Well, one of my coping mechanisms was when somebody would get angry at me, I would go inside myself, get very quiet, wait for it to be over. And if it was accompanied by physical violence, I would go even deeper inside myself. And I don't know whether it was the best coping mechanism, but it was certainly one that I used to survive. And some years ago, but not all that long ago, I have a friend and she got really angry at me. And I went inside myself and I didn't say anything. But we were driving up to the ski base and we were driving back down. And when we got to the car, I got my courage and I said, could we talk about what just happened? And she said, oh, I'm sorry. And it was a wonderful conversation. And I was actually stunned. Here I had taken all my courage to just bring the matter up. And she was very forthcoming and she acknowledged what she said and what she did. And oh, I wasn't hurt. I wasn't upset. And it was fine. It deepened our relationship. So that's a coping mechanism, that example where going into myself and staying silent and not saying, could we talk about this? That's a coping mechanism with a shelf life, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. I have two more questions that were emailed, but if anyone here present would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Claudia, do you have a question or comment?
When you're writing about such horrendous things that happen to you, how do you keep yourself safe so that you can go through the process of it?
Well, I have a cat that doesn't mind being cuddled, and she got cuddled a lot, probably longer than she would have liked. But I can tell you, actually, when I wrote Morning Light, which was my second novel, there's a part in it where I was fictionally writing about abuse, about the protagonist and between the protagonist and her father. Now, that book, that novel, I probably went through 50 drafts, but that one section was first draft. And as I wrote it, I was shaking. And if you ask me, did that really happen? I don't really know. But I can tell you when I was writing, my whole body was shaking and it just poured out. And so when I started writing the memoir, particularly the early abuse, I would write a bit and my body was just shaking. And after I would write, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the first chapters particularly are so short. It was all I could manage. I would go upstairs and make a cup of tea and find my cat or call a friend. And I think that the beginning was, because I didn't write it from beginning to end. I started with the stories that my mother told me about that she thought were very funny, that weren't funny. And so I made a bargain with myself. If you can just write these few pages, then you can go upstairs and have a cup of tea, or you can weave or go out and hike in the mountains. And so I found a rhythm. I would write a bit and then do something that assured me that I was okay, that was the past, and that I could absorb it. And the fact was, I was feeling it, and that meant I was reconnecting. And while it's difficult and painful, it's also healthy, and it allows the unseen forces to become seen, and then I could deal with them.
Thank you, Nancy. You didn't know you'd be buying a house when you visited your son in Santa Fe. You seem to be a very reasonable person, and yet throughout your memoir, you take so many chances and leaps of faith. When it came to your youth summer jobs, your traveling to teach dance in Europe, and the troubles and adventures that brought you. What does it mean to you when you take so many leaps of faith?
Well, actually, I don't even think of them as a leap of faith. I just do them. when I came to Santa Fe with my son, we were on a road trip. And the last day of the visit, the people we were staying with said, why don't you let our realtor show you some houses after lunch? And my son sells houses. I said, fine. And first house was old and ugly and expensive and next to a parking lot. And I thought, good thing I'm not planning to move on to Santa Fe. And then the realtor said, there's a house that just came on the market 2 days ago. And if you don't mind, it's right near here and the owners don't mind, I'd like to take a look. Well, what do I care? I'm just looking. But the funniest thing happened as we were driving up the driveway, my heart started beating kind of funny. And we walked inside, and I'd never been in a house like that. It's an equilateral triangle. And we moved up the stairs, and I thought, I have to live in this house. And I was as astonished as anybody when we went back to the realtor's office and I said, I'd like to buy that house. And my son said, you what? And the realtor said, what? And I said, well, yeah. And so my son, who was a realtor, and the realtor, they made the contract, and I didn't read anything. I just signed it. And then a few months later, my son said, did you ever read the contract? And I said, no. And he said, well, I put a clause in that if your son didn't agree, you couldn't do it. I said, well, why on earth did you do that? He said, because I didn't want you to have buyer's remorse. So I didn't plan it. It just unfolded. And when I was invited to go to Europe, I just said, sure. I mean, I just figure I'll figure it out when the time comes. And so far I have.
You have so many successes and achieved great accomplishments. Yet with so much pain and negativity surrounding you throughout your life, how and where did you find the will to continue working as hard as you have and do it with such great compassion?
Well, I have to tell you, I tried suicide 3 times, and obviously I wasn't very good at it. So that didn't seem to be a possibility. What happened was my life split. I had a personal life, which was very difficult, but then I had my professional life, and I was exceedingly fortunate. I was teaching at the University of Delaware, which is a very conservative institution, and somehow I created all of the courses that I was to teach. And I've had luck. In 1957, I was a student. I had a technical scholarship to study dance at Connecticut College. And the technical director, Tom Watson, I was the kind of person, if you tell me I need help here, I would help. If I need help there. And at the end of the summer, he said, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I owe you big time. So that was 1957. Fast forward to the fall of 1966. And I decided I want a master's in theater, and I go to the theater department, and who is the brand new chair? Tom Watson. And he said, any way I can help you, I will. And to make a long story short, I took one course, and then in January of 67, when my husband finally left, he called me up and said, how would you like a teaching fellowship? And I said, well, Tom, I can't do costumes and I can't do technical stuff. He said, not to worry, the technical director had a nervous breakdown. You can teach movement for actors, which I had never done, but I figured I could figure it out. And then in June, I had to leave because I didn't have any more money, and I had a Title I job in the summer. And in August of 67, he called me up and said, how would you like to finish your degree? I said, Tom, you know I don't have any money. He said, not to worry. The woman who was doing costumes decided to go teach in Vietnam, and so you can keep doing teaching theater movement. And that's when I met David, because my project was, I don't know if you all know Peter and the Wolf, but it ends very unsatisfyingly with the duck in the wolf's stomach, and they're taking the wolf off to the zoo, and the words go something like, and if you listen very carefully, children, you can still hear the duck quacking because the wolf in his hurry swallowed the duck alive. Well, that's a very unsatisfying ending as far as I'm concerned. And so with my students' help, I wrote a second half of the story using Prokofiev's music, using a friend who had a radio station, and a student who sounded like the narrator. And I wrote a second half, and I got that duck out of the wolf's stomach. So that was a very satisfying experience. And David was one of the zookeepers, and so that's how my life unfolds. I mean, I think. Well, let me just say that in 1985, in March and then in November, I went to see two psychics. They didn't know each other, and they started the same way. You were born a child of light into a family of darkness. They tried to extinguish your light. They almost succeeded. And that was word for word. They both said the same thing. So we're not blank slates when we're born. We're dimensional human beings. And I was a child who noticed everything, which I think was one of the reasons I unsettled my mother so much. And I had a very black and white view of good and bad. And as I wrote in the book, I had a sense that somewhere in this world there were scales. And if you put harm into the world, then evil came up. And if you put good into the world, then good would come up. And it was my personal job to keep good into the world, which does not make me a saint, because of course I mess up as much as anybody else. But I still have the sense that if I'm able to choose, I choose to put loving kindness and compassion into the world, because the world doesn't need any more misery.
Thank you, Nancy. Before we wrap up, does anyone else have any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself if you do.
Cheryl?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
You answered one of my questions in your presentation, which begins because I was so enthralled with the way that you interacted with your students. And my question was, did your early childhood learning experiences affect your teaching philosophy? So I just enjoyed that part so much of your book. I'd like you to expound on it just a little bit more, especially the part where you were standing behind your teacher who was reading the book to the class. I love that part.
I was this happened when I was 4 and living in New Jersey, and I was in kindergarten with my cousin, who was a few months older than I am, and the teacher was reading a book, and I went up to her and I was watching her read, and then I said to her, "You're not reading what's in the book." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, would you like to read?" I said, "Okay." And so I took her chair, her stool, and I read what was in the book word for word. And my cousin was not pleased. And he said, "If you tell Mama that you read to the class, you're going to wake up dead." And of course, I didn't know what dead was, but it didn't sound good. And all of my experiences as a student, I was very aware of how children were mistreated. Even if a teacher wasn't actually trying, they just weren't kind and they weren't caring. And it was really important to me that students feel safe in my classes and that we could talk about sensitive things in a kind way. So I had rules. For example, you couldn't say, "This is a terrible class," but you could say, "I hate this class." And then, of course, after the class got finished gasping, I would say, "So tell me more." And, there's not a book that's been written that everybody loves. There's not a teacher involved. Well, maybe Thich Nhat Hanh, everybody loves him, and the Dalai Lama, but that's not who I am. And so I'm happy to hear what people have to say. And from a friend, I learned that it's really important to listen and not to come quick with my story, but to let their story have room and space. So I've learned a lot from my friends, and I'm grateful for them. And some of my friends, like Susan Felix, who's here, we met on a picket line when my son was 2 and he's now 60. So we've been friends for 58 years. And I feel very, very fortunate. And before we end, I'd like to read, there's an old Gaelic chant in which 9 graces are invoked to bestow their love upon a person. Then the following words are spoken. A shade thou art in the heat, a shelter thou art in the cold, eyes thou art to the blind, a staff that thou art to the pilgrim, an island thou art at sea, a fortress thou art on land, a well that thou art in the desert, health thou art to the ailing, let there be joy.
Thank you, Nancy. In the chat, we have Tara says, how incredible you are, Nancy. Sorry to be late, but so happy to hear your story. Claudia says, what an inspiring person you are, Nancy. I wish you'd read the poem you wrote. And to everyone here, we're going to have a second event with Nancy in June. So check the Santa Fe Public Library calendar for that. And hopefully everyone will have a chance to have read Breaking the Silence by then, and we can have an even further discussion and discover more about Nancy King and her amazing life.
I'd just like to say that if anybody is interested, you can buy my book from my website, nancykingstories.com, or you can order it from bookshop.org or Amazon if you're so inclined. And of course, you can borrow it from the library. And again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Jessica and Maria for doing this. I think you're all wonderful. And so be safe and be well. And thank you for participating. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you everyone making it such a great event. And I hope you join us for the second one in June. Everyone stay safe, read books, read Breaking the Silence by Nancy King, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone involved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming.
I
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.